A ruthless mafia boss dressed in white finds his world turned to mud when a cardboard box in a rainy alley reveals the one secret he never expected: his own child. The rain fell in relentless sheets, washing the neon glow of Seoul into the gutters of the grimy back alley. Yoon Sung-hoon stood at the entrance of the narrow passage, a figure of terrifying elegance. He was wrapped in a tailored white suit that seemed to repel the filth around him, its sharp lapels and fitted cut signaling a man of absolute wealth and lethal authority. His hair was neatly slicked back, untouched by the chaos of the storm, while rainwater traced cold paths down his temples without disrupting his composed appearance. This was a man who commanded an empire of shadows, yet here he was, standing at the center of a world he did not belong to. The silence of the alley was more jarring than a siren's scream. It was heavy, weighted by the scent of wet cardboard and old metal. His eyes, usually cold and merciless, swept across the trash until they settled on a weathered cardboard box placed directly on the wet pavement. Its flaps were bent outward, soaked through, and defenseless against the downpour. Inside, wrapped loosely in a thin, pale blanket, lay a newborn baby. Sung-hoon's heart, a muscle he had spent years hardening into stone, suddenly hammered against his ribs. The baby's tiny face was peaceful, eyes closed and cheeks soft, completely unaware of the danger surrounding them. Rain beaded along the edges of the box, but miraculously, the child remained dry inside, a fragile, unsettling contrast to the harsh urban graveyard. For the first time in his life, the monster hesitated. Sung-hoon took a step forward, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscle in his strong jawline twitched. Every survival instinct that had kept him alive in the underworld screamed at him to maintain his distance, to remain the untouchable king. Instead, he did something that would have made his subordinates freeze in shock. He knelt, the immaculate white fabric of his trousers pressed into the rain-soaked mud, soaking up the grime of the alley. He didn't care. His presence, usually so commanding, felt suddenly, painfully undone. His lips were slightly parted as if he were holding his breath, afraid that even the sound of his pulse would break the child's peace. Slowly, his hand extended, not the hand of a violent man in action, but one trembling with an uncharacteristically careful, dawning emotion. His fingers hovered just inches above the baby, a gesture of hesitant protection. In that moment, the armor he had built around his soul didn't just crack, it shattered. Shock, guilt, and a raw vulnerability etched themselves into his serious features. This wasn't just an abandoned life balanced on a moment of discovery. It was his own flesh and blood. The most feared man in Seoul had been brought to his knees, finally saved by the very innocence he thought he had destroyed. The heavy oak doors of the Sung-hoon estate swung open with a groan that echoed through the silent, marble-clad foyer. Amada Johnson was on her knees, polishing the base of a grand staircase. Her movements were mechanical, and her head was bowed low. In this house, invisibility was the only form of job security. But the sound that followed the opening of the door wasn't the sharp, rhythmic click of the boss's leather heels. It was a heavy, squelching thud, followed by a sound that did not belong in a fortress of stone and secrets, the thin, warbling cry of a newborn child. Amada's breath hitched in her throat. She looked up, her eyes widening as she saw the silhouette of Yoon Sung-hoon. The man who usually looked like he was carved from polished ice was drenched to the bone. His immaculate white suit, the symbol of his untouchable status, was smeared with dark, gritty mud at the knees and cuffs. But it was the bundle in his arms, the weathered, damp cardboard box held with a desperate, clumsy grip, that made Amada's heart stop. The other staff members retreated into the shadows like ghosts, terrified of the volatile energy radiating from their master. But Sung-hoon's gaze, sharp and burning with an unrecognizable fever, locked onto Amada. He didn't look at her as a servant. He looked at her as a lifeline. He strode toward her, the scent of ozone and rain-washed pavement following him like a shroud. The baby inside the box began to wail, a raw, primal sound that shattered the sterile, oppressive silence of the mansion. "Fix this," Sung-hoon commanded. His voice was a low rasp, stripped of its usual melodic authority and replaced by a jagged edge of panic. He thrust the damp box toward her, his hands trembling with the weight of the discovery. Amada's hands shook as she reached out. She knew the stories of the men who had disappeared for simply looking Sung-hoon in the eye, yet here he was, surrendering the most vulnerable thing in his world to her. As her fingers touched the damp cardboard and then the soft, warm skin of the infant, a jolt of protective electricity surged through her. The baby, Jian, stopped crying the moment Amada's warmth met his tiny, translucent hand curling instinctively around her thumb. Sung-hoon watched the interaction, his chest heaving under the ruined silk of his shirt. For a heartbeat, the monster and the maid stood in a shared, terrifying silence. Amada saw the flicker of agonizing guilt in his eyes, the realization that he had brought a miracle into a house of death. She was no longer just a cleaner. She was the bridge between a father's blood-stained past and a child's uncertain future. "He needs warmth," Amada whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. "And he needs you to stay back until I've cleaned the chill from his bones." Sung-hoon didn't argue. He simply watched, a man finally realizing that his power meant nothing against the fragility of the life now resting in Amada's care. The medical report sat on the mahogany desk like a death warrant, though its contents spoke of a beginning rather than an end. The silence in the study was surgical, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that sounded like a countdown. Yoon Sung-hoon did not move. He stared at the bold, clinical figures at the bottom of the page, 99.9%. The debt was real. The child in the next room was not a stray found in the rain. She was a Yoon, a piece of his own fractured soul wrapped in a pale blanket. The shock that had brought him to his knees in the mud had curdled into something far more dangerous. It was no longer a question of whether he could be a father, but a realization of ownership. In the underworld, what belongs to the king is sacred, and what is sacred must be guarded with blood. Amada was in the nursery, her shadow stretching long across the floor as she hummed a low, soulful melody to the sleeping Jian. She didn't hear him enter. In his world, Sung-hoon moved like a ghost, but today, his presence felt heavy, pressing against the walls of the room like a physical weight. When she finally turned and saw him, the air left her lungs. He didn't look like the man who had been undone in the alley. His white suit had been replaced by a charcoal black silk robe, and his eyes had regained their terrifying, focused clarity. He didn't look at Amada. He looked only at the crib. "The test is finished," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to make the very floorboards tremble. Amada gripped the edge of the rocking chair. "And she is mine." The words were quiet, but they carried the finality of a gavel. He stepped closer to the crib, his shadow falling over the infant. "From this moment on, no one enters this wing without my personal clearance. Not the doctor, not the guards, and certainly not my associates." He reached down, his long fingers tracing the edge of the wooden railing. He didn't touch the baby yet, but the way he hovered over her was no longer hesitant. It was the stance of a predator guarding its only treasure. "Amada," he said, finally shifting his gaze to her. The intensity in his eyes made her blood run cold. It wasn't the look of a happy man. It was the look of a man who had found a reason to burn the world down. "You will be her shield. You will sleep in the adjoining room. You will eat only what is prepared under your own eyes. If she cries, you answer. If she breathes differently, you tell me." Amada saw the flicker of a new, terrifying possessiveness in the set of his jaw. He wasn't just protecting a daughter. He was claiming a legacy he never thought he'd have. The monster had found his anchor, and God help anyone who tried to pull it away. Amada watched from the hallway as a team of men in tactical gear installed biometric scanners outside the nursery door. The cold, blue light of the fingerprint readers looked jarringly out of place next to the hand-painted mural of a soft, sleeping moon that Sung-hoon had commissioned for the nursery wall. It was a world of impossible contradictions. On the mahogany changing table sat a row of glass baby bottles, organized with military precision, right beside a secure tablet displaying real-time thermal feeds from every corner of the estate. Then came the nannies. They arrived in a black SUV, two women with the posture of seasoned soldiers and eyes that missed nothing. They didn't carry traditional diaper bags. They carried concealed sidearms and encrypted communication devices. Sung-hoon introduced them to Amada not as caregivers, but as security specialists with advanced pediatric certification. They moved through the halls with a silent, predatory grace, their presence turning the domestic space into a labyrinth of checkpoints. Amada felt the weight of their gaze every time she picked up Jian, a constant reminder that this was no longer a home, but a bunker. Sung-hoon spent his nights in the surveillance room, the glow of a dozen monitors reflecting in his dark, unblinking eyes. He watched Jian sleep from every possible angle, his fingers ghosting over the glass of the screens. He had built a golden cage, a place where the air was filtered, and every heartbeat was recorded by sensors. Is all of this truly for her? Amada asked one evening, finding him standing by the nursery's new reinforced steel door. Sung-hoon didn't look at her. He was watching a nanny check the room's oxygen levels for the third time that hour. In my world, Amada, safety is an illusion that must be bought with vigilance. I have spent my life making enemies. Now, I will spend my life making sure they can never touch what is mine. He reached out, his hand resting on the cold steel of the biometric lock. The man who had once ruled through fear was now a prisoner of his own devotion, a king who had turned his palace into a fortress to shield a single, fragile life from the very shadows he had helped create. The view from the third-story nursery was supposed to be a luxury, a sweeping vista of Seoul's skyline and the meticulously manicured gardens below. But to Amada, the floor-to-ceiling windows felt like a giant bullseye. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, she stood by the reinforced glass, gently patting Jian's back. The baby was finally asleep, a warm, heavy weight against her shoulder, blissfully unaware that her very existence had turned this mansion into the most dangerous coordinate in the city. Amada's eyes narrowed as she scanned the perimeter wall. For 3 days, a sleek, silver sedan had been parked near the gated entrance of the neighboring estate. It never stayed long enough to be questioned by the gatehouse, but it always appeared at the same hour, the hour when the shift of the external guards changed. She watched as a glint of light, sharp and predatory, flashed from the sedan's tinted window. It wasn't the reflection of the sun. It was the lens of a long-range camera. Her blood turned to ice. She wasn't a soldier, but she had lived in the shadow of the Sung-hoon syndicate long enough to recognize the scouts. They weren't looking for a way in. They were cataloging patterns. They were hunting. They're watching us, aren't they? Amada's voice was a mere breath in the darkened room. She didn't have to turn around to know Sung-hoon was there. His presence always preceded him, a shift in the air pressure that made the hair on her arms stand up. He stepped out of the shadows, his face illuminated only by the faint glow of the baby monitor. He didn't look at the sedan, he looked at Jian. "The Kim crew is bold," he said, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "They think they found my soft underbelly. They think a child is a weakness to be exploited." "Is she?" Amada asked, her grip on the baby tightening instinctively. Sung-hoon finally looked at her, and for a second, the cold professionalism of the Mafia boss was replaced by something much more feral. "A child is not a weakness, Amada. She is a reason to be more ruthless than they ever imagined." He reached out, his thumb grazing the infant's soft cheek. "They aren't just watching a house. They are watching their own graves being dug. But until I finish the job, you do not take her near the windows. You do not leave the nursery wing. The game has changed." Amada looked back out at the silver car as it slowly pulled away. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Jian wasn't just a secret daughter anymore. In the eyes of Sung-hoon's enemies, she was the ultimate leverage, a tiny, innocent life that could bring the most powerful man in Korea to his knees. The fortress was no longer about keeping her in. It was about the war that was surely coming to their front door. The tension within the mansion had become a living thing, a suffocating blanket of biometric beeps and hushed tactical reports. But at 3 in the morning, the fortress fell into a strange silence. The high-tech monitors hummed quietly in the background, and even the shadows seemed to hold their breath. Amada was preparing a bottle in the kitchenette when she felt that familiar shift in the air. She didn't turn around. She knew Sung-hoon had entered the nursery. He moved with the silent grace of a ghost, his charcoal robe trailing behind him like a funeral shroud. He stood over the crib, his face a mask of exhaustion and lethal focus. He had just come from a meeting that had likely cost men their lives. Yet here he was, standing before a 6-pound infant. Jian stirred, her tiny, rounded face scrunched up, and for a moment, Amada feared the child would cry. triggering the alert systems and bringing the guards running. Instead, the baby opened her dark, clear eyes and looked directly at the man looming over her. Sung-hoon remained frozen, his hands clenched at his sides. He was a man who understood fear, respect, and betrayal, but he did not understand the uncomplicated gaze of an innocent. Then it happened. Slowly, Jeon's tiny lips curved upward. It wasn't a reflex. It was a bright, gummy, and unmistakable smile directed entirely at the monster in the tailored robe. The effect was instantaneous. The rigid line of Sung-hoon's shoulders dropped. The merciless set of his jaw softened, and for the first time since Amada had known him, the predatory light in his eyes flickered out, replaced by a raw, naked wonder. He reached out, his long, scarred finger trembling as Jeon's small hand reached up to grab it. Her grip was weak, but to Sung-hoon, it clearly felt like the strongest force in the world. She knows me," he whispered, his voice cracking, stripped of its steel. Amada watched from the doorway, her heart aching. In that small, quiet moment, the high-tech security and the looming war outside felt miles away. The armor he had spent decades forging was useless against a baby's smile. It was a crack in the foundation of the man he used to be. He wasn't just a boss or a killer in that moment. He was a father being recognized by his child. The transformation was heartbreaking to witness. A man realizing that he finally had something he was truly terrified to lose. The monster had been seen, and the person looking back hadn't blinked. The silence in the nursery was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with the weight of ghosts. Sung-hoon stood by the reinforced window, his back to the crib, staring into the dark reflection of the room. The moment of connection with Jeon, that impossible, innocent smile, had not brought him comfort. Instead, it had dredged up a terror far deeper than the threat of the Kim clan waiting outside the gates. "You look at her like she's a bomb waiting to go off," Amada said softly, her voice cutting through the hum of the air filtration system. She was sitting in the rocking chair, her hands resting idly in her lap, watching the man who controlled the city unravel. "I look at her," Sung-hoon replied, his voice rough, "and I see the inevitable." He turned slowly, the shadows clinging to the sharp angles of his face. "You asked me once why I hesitated in the alley. Why didn't you pick her up immediately? I thought you were in shock." "I was." He walked over to the crib, keeping a safe distance, as if his very proximity might poison the air. "I was looking at a mirror. My father, he was a man of consequence, much like me. When I was born, I wasn't left in a box, Amada. I was left in a room with a loaded gun and a locked door. He told his men that if I survived the night, I was his son. If I didn't, I was a mistake." Amada's breath caught. "You were a child. I was a liability. A stain on a pristine reputation." Sung-hoon's eyes were distant, seeing a different room, a different darkness. He believed that violence was in the blood, that some of us are born with a rot inside. He left me to see if the monster would eat me, or if I would become the monster to survive. He looked down at his hands, hands that had ended lives, hands that now paid for the most expensive security systems in Seoul. "I survived, and in doing so, I proved him right." He looked back at Jeon, sleeping soundly, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm of pure trust. "I abandoned her mother because I thought I was protecting her from this life. And yet, Jeon ended up in an alley anyway. The sin isn't that she was abandoned, Amada. The sin is that she carries my blood. I am terrified that no matter how high I build these walls, the rot is already inside with us." "That baby doesn't see a monster," Amada said, standing up and moving to block his line of sight, forcing him to look at her. "She sees the man who pulled her out of the rain. For now," Sung-hoon whispered, the fear in his eyes stark and devastating. But monsters always reveal themselves in the end. The storm outside had turned into a gale, hammering against the mansion walls like a fist demanding entry. But inside the nursery, the silence was absolute, until it wasn't. It didn't start with a scream, but with a low, vibrating hum that Sung-hoon felt in the soles of his shoes a split second before the perimeter alarms finally shrieked. "Get down," he commanded, his voice terrifyingly flat. Amada barely had time to clutch Jeon to her chest before the world erupted. The reinforced violet glass, designed to withstand small arms fire, couldn't hold against the high-velocity impact that slammed into the center of the pane. The window didn't just break, it exploded inward, raining razor-sharp shards like deadly diamonds across the nursery floor. In that fraction of a second, the distance between the man and the monster vanished. Sung-hoon didn't reach for his weapon first. He dove. He was a blur of white motion, throwing his body over Amada and the crib, acting as a human shield against the cascade of glass and the hail of bullets that followed. Amada screamed, curling over the baby, but the impact she braced for never came. Instead, she felt the heavy, solid weight of Sung-hoon covering them completely. He grunted, a sharp, wet sound, as debris tore into his back. When the initial volley ceased, replaced by the shouts of men storming the hallway, Sung-hoon rose. The transformation was complete. The immaculate, tailored white suit, the symbol of his untouchable power, was ruined. A deep crimson stain blossomed across the shoulder and back of the jacket, vivid and shocking against the white silk. He didn't look at the wound. He spun toward the door, a gun materializing in his hand with lethal fluidity. His face was no longer the mask of a distant king. It was the face of a father cornered. "They are inside," he snarled, firing 2 shots through the nursery door as the lock disintegrated under a breaching charge. A body dropped in the hallway with a heavy thud. Amada, the panel behind the dresser. "Go. Now, you're bleeding," Amada cried, her eyes fixed on the spreading red stain. "I said go," Sung-hoon roared, the sound tearing from his throat like a wild animal. He turned back to the shattered window, raising his weapon to meet the shadows rappelling down the outer wall. "Take her to the vault. Do not open it until you hear my voice. If you hear anyone else, you silence the child." The pristine icon was gone, buried under blood and glass. In its place stood a man who had finally found something worth bleeding for. The secret panel slid shut with a hiss of hydraulic seals, plunging Amada and Jian into a world of pressurized silence. The panic room was a cold, sterile cube of reinforced steel and concrete, illuminated only by the faint, rhythmic pulse of emergency amber lights. It felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb, buried deep within the heart of the mansion. Amada slid down the cold metal wall, her legs finally giving way. She clutched Jian so tightly against her chest that she could feel the baby's heartbeat fluttering like a trapped bird against her own ribs. The air in the room was recycled, cool and tasteless, stripped of the scent of cordite and blood that had filled the nursery just seconds before. Then, the thunder began. It wasn't the weather. It was a dull, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the floorboards and into Amada's bones. Muffled by layers of steel and stone, the gunfire sounded like a distant storm, a relentless drumming that spoke of violence on a scale she couldn't comprehend. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the image of Yoon Sung-hoon standing amidst the shattering glass, his pristine white suit ruined by the crimson map of his own sacrifice. "He's protecting you," Amada whispered into the baby's soft hair, her voice trembling in the recycling air. "He's fighting the monsters so you don't have to see them." Jian shifted, letting out a small, confused whimper. Amada rocked her, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. She had spent weeks terrified of the man outside, afraid of his cold eyes and his lethal silence. Now, that same lethality was the only thing standing between them and the abyss. Every vibration in the floor was a reminder that Sung-hoon was out there, alone, dismantling the threats against his bloodline with the same terrifying efficiency he used to build his empire. The vibrations grew more intense, a crescendo of heavy impacts that felt like the house itself was being torn apart. Amada imagined the Kim crew moving through the halls, and Sung-hoon meeting them not as a businessman, but as the storm made flesh. He was burning down his own kingdom, room by room, to ensure that the fire never reached this vault. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the thunder stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. It was a suffocating, absolute stillness that pressed against Amada's ears. She stared at the heavy steel door, her breath hitched in her throat. There were no sirens, no shouts of victory, just the terrifying quiet of a battlefield after the smoke has cleared. She waited for the keypad to beep, for the voice of the man in the white suit to tell them it was over. But the door remained sealed, and the silence stretched on, vast and terrifying. The hiss of the hydraulic seals breaking felt like the first breath of air after a long drowning. As the heavy steel door of the vault groaned open, Amada shielded Jian's eyes, her own heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She expected the smell of smoke, the chaos of a broken fortress, or the cold faces of the Kim crew. Instead, she found a man who had been hollowed out and rebuilt by the fire. Yoon Sung-hoon stood in the center of the ruined hallway. The storm-made flesh had passed, leaving behind a silence that was heavy and absolute. His tailored white suit was a ghost of its former self, torn at the shoulder and soaked through with deep, dark blossoms of red. He leaned heavily against the marble wall, a jagged scar across his cheek still weeping blood, but his eyes were no longer the cold, distant mirrors of a syndicate boss. They were human. "Give her to me," he rasped, his voice a broken melody of exhaustion and relief. Amada stepped over the debris of the biometric scanners and the shattered remains of the high-tech fortress. She placed the sleeping Jian into his trembling arms. As he pulled the child against his chest, the man who had once feared the rot in his blood let out a long, shuddering breath. He buried his face in the baby's soft, pale blanket, inhaling the scent of milk and innocence that had somehow survived the gunpowder. The mansion was a wreck, the golden cage was broken, and the empire he had built on fear was likely crumbling in the wake of the night's violence. But as Sung-hoon looked down at his daughter, who stirred and let out a soft, dreaming sigh against his blood-stained lapel, he didn't look like a man who had lost everything. He looked like a man who had finally been found. "The monster is dead, Amada," he whispered, his gaze drifting to the shattered windows where the first light of a gray-souled dawn was beginning to bleed through the clouds. He wasn't talking about his enemies. He was talking about the man he had been since the night his own father left him in the dark.